celebration of this 350th anniversary year. And those of you who knew Dick are aware of his many contributions to this community and of his legendary skills as a writer and as a teller of stories. He was a storehouse of local lore. And over the years, Dick probably forgot more than most of us will ever know about Northampton history. Dick Garvey will be missed, but we will remember his stories. It's my pleasure today to welcome you on behalf of Historic Northampton and in partnership with the Smith College History Department to the 10th lecture in the 350th Anniversary Lecture Series. Major funding for this series is provided by the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, which is a vital part of our community as it supports humanities programs not only here but throughout the Commonwealth. And as we approach the end of this 350th anniversary year, I want to remind you that our work at Historic Northampton will not be over, but we'll be working to sustain the quality of our museum and programs like this for the next generation. Our new exhibit at Historic Northampton marks the 80th anniversary of an election that signaled a new era in American politics. It has been called the radio election because it was the first time that national broadcasting became an instrument of political campaigning. But it also marked a fundamental shift in the way that presidential campaigns were financed and managed. 1924, the radio election, presidential campaigning in the Coolidge era opens October 1st with a reception at Historic Northampton from 4 to 6 p.m. and you can consider yourself cordially invited. I hope to see you there. I also invite you to become a part of this exciting work that we're doing here at Historic Northampton and to help us meet the needs of the 21st century as we engage it. Become a friend and a supporter of Historic Northampton and its programs, and you can do that by filling out the card at the back of your program and returning it to the table at the, in the lobby, or you can mail it to the address that's written on the card. Let me also remind you that these lectures, along with other articles, will be collected in an anthology, a place called Paradise, Culture and Community in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1654 to 2004, and published with the University of Massachusetts Press. And we hope to have it available just before the holidays, so I urge you to reserve a copy of this book by filling out the enclosed card in your program and returning it to the table in the rear, or if you are watching this on cable TV, you can call and reserve your copy at 584-6011. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have Stephen Nissenbaum among us again, and this afternoon he will share with us his work on Sylvester Graham, a man who was supremely confident that his name would become a household word, but never dreamed that it would be associated mainly with Hershey bars and marshmallows. Stephen Nissenbaum is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Major publications include The Battle for Christmas, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, Sex, Diet, and Debility in Jacksonian America, Sylvester Graham and Health Reform, and Salem Possessed, The Social Origins of Witchcraft, with Paul Boyer, which won the American Historical Association's Dunning Prize. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Nissenbaum.
This is the first time I've ever been referred to as emeritus, and I'm not sure I can go on. But I thank you, Carrie, for the introduction, and since the Mass Foundation is a major source of funding for this, I want to thank personally David Tibaldi for his long years of friendship. David is the executive director. As Carrie said just a moment ago, Graham's name does not linger in a way that he would have appreciated. Graham crackers, Graham bread, Graham flour, which have nothing to do with anything that he believed in or stood for, completely detached from his name. It's not a fate that he would have desired. I should also add that, of course, for those of you who live in the neighborhood, that his name also continues, his first name, in the restaurant Sylvester's, located in the one house he ever owned and resided in from 1839 to his death in 1851. He wouldn't have approved of the restaurant either. Finally, for some of you, I'm sure, in this audience, he's remembered locally in the charming play that was written and produced about 3 years ago by Judge Mike Ryan, presented at the Academy of Music. And I think, Mike, you're here today. So he's remembered locally, perhaps in ways that he's not remembered nationally. Mike Ryan's play is the one that does anything like justice to him, really. But historically, Sylvester Graham is important for his larger vision of human health. And I want to start this lecture with the briefest of all summaries of Graham's position. I'm not going to read any quotes. I'm simply going to summarize this briefly, and then the rest of it I hope will become clear as I expand it beyond Graham. We'll be getting back to him. Graham articulated everything that I'm about to say in the course of a single decade, the 1830s, when he was in his late 30s and early 40s. Historically, Graham was the first and the most significant American theorist of vegetarianism. He was the first really American to promulgate a vegetarian diet, and the very first to do so on purely physiological grounds, as opposed to biblical or other kinds of principles. He proscribed the eating of meat, but not only of meat, but also of anything that he considered stimulating. Tea and coffee, salt and pepper, other spices, spicy foods, hot foods, artificially concentrated foods such as soups, and I could but won't go on. Not surprisingly, Sylvester Graham was also associated with the movement for temperance, to get people to stop drinking alcoholic beverages. He was one of the earliest Americans to advocate total abstinence from alcoholic beverages. Finally, and this is the way I got interested in him, he was the first American reformer to stress the grave dangers posed by sexual excess. Not only premarital sex and adultery, but also, and indeed especially, masturbation and frequent sex within marriage itself. Both of these were bad, in Graham's view, not because they were forbidden by the law or by the Bible, but because they were capable of doing immense harm to the human body. So it was a physiological analysis that he offered. And these prescriptions, vegetarianism, temperance, great concern with sexual practice of all sorts, all of these proscriptions were deeply interconnected in his overall theory of health, commonly termed the Graham system during the 1830s, and which Graham himself preferred to call the science of human life, which was the title of his 2-volume magnum opus published in 1839 in Boston. That was the very year that he moved to Northampton. In fact, Graham first advocated pure vegetarianism in his 1834 lecture to young men on chastity, which was his anti-masturbation piece. So vegetarianism and anti-masturbation go together. So what was this larger vision about? Let me give you what I shouldn't refer to as a quick and dirty summary, but there it is in my notes. The science of human life was, and I'm going to simplify here, but my simplification will remain accurate. Graham's science of human life was founded on a reversal of the old distinction between stimulation and debility. Previously, and essentially this goes all the way back to classical antiquity, these two had been seen as opposites, as different extremes. And the way that you treated an excess of either the one or the other was to provoke the one that it wasn't. Thus, you needed to stimulate a person who was in debilitated or weakened condition, typically by giving them a shot of meat or alcohol, which were stimulating, and less frequently the reverse, by calming an overstimulated person. Graham, using an idea first proposed by the well-known revolutionary era physician Benjamin Rush, insisted, and this was new, that artificial stimulation, far from being therapy for weakness or debility, was actually its most common cause. For that reason, and this is where Graham picked up on it, alcohol and meat had the effect not of stimulating a person who was weak, but of further weakening that person. Graham, in fact, expanded the list of artificial stimulants, as I've just indicated, to include sex and other excitements of the nervous system, reading novels, for instance, which was, he was not alone in that, but he made it physiological rather than social as a danger. Yeah, novel reading was regarded as addictive by many people in the generation before Graham, in much the way that TV or even drugs are regarded as addictive today. Finally, using the work of several French physiologists that had just been translated into English, Graham used a further argument or a further proposition, and that was that the sexual organs and the digestive ones were profoundly interactive. They were interlinked by the recently discovered autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system. Thus, using all of this stuff that I've given you and some others as well, sexual excitement would not only arouse and then weaken a person directly, but it would also produce digestive ailments through the interaction with the autonomic nervous system, ultimately with the digestive system. And digestive excitement, similarly, would artificially stimulate sexual desire. That was the physiological theory. And together, either sexual excitement or bad diet, stimulating diet, or worse, both together, would produce debility and disease. So that was the model. Sexual excitement would produce digestive ailments. Digestive excitement would stimulate sexual desire. That, in essence, led to the Graham system. Sexual abstinence, a soothing diet, a serene emotional life, all mutually enforcing, just as their opposites were. Thus, we get Graham bread, Graham flour, later Graham crackers. Graham, in fact, I'll say just a word about that. Graham attacked with particular vehemence bread that was commercially produced, which we can think of as essentially being white bread. It was advertised as coming from superfine flour. He criticized it from the way it was grown to the way it was manufactured. It was produced from wheat that had been grown on artificially stimulated soil. That's to say, force-fed with animal fertilizers. Graham said you could often detect the odor of the fertilizer in the finished bread. Conventional commercial bread had all the natural and soothing outer husks of the wheat milled out to make superfine flour. And bakers, Graham insisted, sometimes even added harmful chemicals and inorganic matter to increase the bulk. He accused them of using plaster of Paris in with the flour. I'm sure, that was sometimes done. Graham bread, then, really meant home-ground, home-cooked, whole wheat bread, left to cool and even to become a little bit stale and masticated thoroughly. It might be helpful for us to think of it as a symbol of a fast disappearing subsistence economy and the replacement of that economy by the fast-paced and impersonal capitalist marketplace. In the words of the title that this lecture has been assigned, The Physiology of Subsistence. We might also think of Graham bread as an early form of nostalgia for an imagined past, or an early form of anti-modernism, if you like. And in fact, the actual production of wheat had been transformed during the 1820s, the decade before Graham wrote, largely by the Erie Canal. For those of you who may know Paul Johnson's book, A Shopkeeper's Millennium, the rapidly changing economy of Rochester, New York, which is the community that Johnson writes about in that book, was based on wheat, the production, largely on the production of wheat. And indeed, an Amherst newspaper in the mid-1820s was advertising superfine flour direct from Rochester. That reference I get from Christopher Clark, who's also here today. So much for the theory. Graham was also important in his heyday and afterwards. His importance was recognized, and that's what I want to turn to again briefly now. There were health organizations founded, if not in his name, then according to his principles. For instance, the American Physiological Society in Boston. There were Graham hotels and Graham boarding houses in major cities. They served no alcohol, no meat, no tea, coffee, etc., and you could stay in them if you were traveling, and many people did. There was a magazine, the Graham Journal of Health and Longevity, edited by the man who had managed the Graham boarding house in Boston, whose name was David Campbell. And in fact, in 1839, David Campbell moved from Boston, from being the editor of the Graham Journal of Health and Longevity, to Oberlin College, recently founded, and whose new president, the prominent evangelical minister Charles G. Finney, had invited him to take charge of the college's living and dining arrangements. Of course, Campbell set the college menu in strict accordance with the Graham system: no animal food, etc., etc. Within a few years, Grahamite principles had come to infuse a whole bevy of even newer and amazingly popular movements. Most notable among them, the water cure movement, and there was some of that here in Northampton too, and the phrenological movement, that is to say, the study of individual character through examining the configuration of the skull. Soon, at least two religious groups adopted Grahamite principles. First, the Shakers, who had been in existence for 40 years here, and they were already celibate. But during the 1840s, most Shakers came to adopt the Graham diet, and also a new religious sect dating back to the mid-1840s, which eventually became known as Seventh-day Adventism. Finally, the Graham system led directly to the development of what would become a major American industry, that of breakfast cereals. The Kellogg Company, the cereal company, was founded as a Seventh-day Adventist outgrowth by a man named John Harvey Kellogg, who had himself come out of the water cure movement. Kellogg's cornflakes, in fact, may be the most direct modern descendant of Graham crackers. A lot of the Graham diet, and certainly not what is called and sold as Graham crackers today. But I guess there's sugar in cornflakes, right? Probably? Yeah, so not even that. Lest this seem like a bunch of weirdos to you, I want to just spend a moment arguing that, and this is important for the rest of what I'm about to say, that it was actually part of a progressive movement, a forward-looking movement. For instance, Oberlin, which was an entire college that adopted the Graham diet intact. Oberlin was also the first college to admit women, the first American college to admit women, and the first American college to admit people of color. And indeed, evangelical Protestantism played a progressive role in the 1830s and for a couple of decades thereafter. It gave women a more important voice, and it played an absolutely driving role in the movement to abolish slavery. And what I want to conclude this first part of my talk with is to note that virtually every radical abolitionist everybody who was in favor of the immediate and total abolition of slavery. Virtually every radical abolitionist was also a Grahamite. You scratch one of these people and you find that they were living by something close to the Graham system, or trying to. William Lloyd Garrison himself, the founder of radical abolitionism, stayed in a Graham boarding house whenever he visited New York City. And Graham's own last published writing, printed here in Northampton, was an attack on Daniel Webster for Webster's support of the Compromise of 1850, and especially the fugitive slave law. Well, I want to turn at this point to another question, but a related one. And it's the question that Carrie started with and I started with, that why has Graham's name become forgotten? And just the word Graham crackers is all that exists. Well, in fact, Graham's personal popularity clearly began to decline in the 1840s, the decade after he made his career beginning as an evangelical minister, then as a temperance agent, and then just as an itinerant lecturer and writer. All that happened during the 30s. In 1839, he moved to Northampton, largely, I believe, gave up the itinerant lecture circuit. But at the very time, say around 1840, that his ideas were spreading most rapidly, his own personal reputation, or popularity at least, kind of fades. Why? Well, I'm going to spend probably most of the rest of this lecture, maybe all of it, giving just the first of what I think are two reasons. Well, how do you explain it? Well, partly you have to explain it by just historical contingency and temperament. When Graham moved to Northampton, as I say, he largely abandoned the lecture circuit. You can see his move here as a retreat of sorts, this sort of personal way of getting out of the mad world of itinerant lecturing, really. The place he moved, Northampton, was only 25 miles upriver from his birthplace in West Suffield, Connecticut. Furthermore, Graham was clearly something of an eccentric. He may have been psychologically unstable. His mother had been declared psychologically unstable when Sylvester was just a child, and he and some of his siblings had been taken away from her. He clearly behaved in eccentric, or in a way that people felt were eccentric. Mike Ryan, just a little while ago, reminded me of his habit of coming down to the Mill River to bathe. Again, part of the Graham system was cold stuff, and cold water would become the essence of the water cure movement. And he would do this only in a bathrobe, what we would now call a bathrobe. Furthermore, Graham didn't affiliate himself institutionally with his own followers, and he seems to have alienated many of his own supporters. But what I want to add to that is something I think more historically significant, and that is, I want to argue that Graham was very much a man of the 1830s, that he couldn't have come and done what he did before, and that he didn't move into the 1840s as other people did and as he might have. Before the 1830s, there was in fact no radical reform. There was, for instance, an anti-slavery movement, but that was a movement based on gradually emancipating slaves, not totally and immediately. It was William Lloyd Garrison in 1831, the very beginning of the decade, who radicalized the anti-slavery movement. And similarly, it was in the 1830s that the temperance movement got radicalized. There was a temperance movement before the 1830s. In general, it said, don't drink hard liquor. Beer and wine is okay. Nobody's ever said they were intoxicating. Even occasional hard liquor is okay. It's just a matter of not binging, not drinking to excess. Radical reform in the 1830s was in large part a matter of radical withdrawal from or rejection of established social institutions. You can see this in Garrison, and you can perhaps see it most vividly in Thoreau going to Walden. Also, something like Graham bred, like the Graham diet. You can think of what Graham did with the human body as turning it into a little Walden pond, a little oasis of serenity. But all this changed, or didn't. Things changed in the early 1840s. And this is important, and I can't do justice to it, and I won't even try. But what I will say is that reformers began in the 1840s to reconceive and systematically to reconceive and to reconfigure what we would now call interpersonal relationships of all sorts. This was the decade of communes, the Fourierite communes, including the Northampton Association. Chris, have you lectured on that here already?
Yep.
Yeah. This is the decade that Chris Clark has termed the communitarian moment, at least in the title of his book. But this reconfiguration of interpersonal relationships very much included sexual ones, and especially marriage. Marriage, to do this something of an injustice, had previously been just assumed to be an institutional relationship involving two families joining together, involving parental permission or even parental initiative, and careful property arrangements. In the 1840s, for reasons that were partly related to actual changes in courtship practice, a number of reformers quite suddenly began to reconceive marriage in purely personal terms, as a purely personal relationship between two people based on mutual affinity and mutual attraction. In other words, it's an arrangement based on nature and biology rather than law or religion or family control. In fact, I would think that that's one reason that young people turned, as they did in the 1840s, to phrenology, the study of who you are by the contours of your head, because this was phrenology provided, and there were phrenological books on this. Phrenology provided young people with help in determining personal compatibility that was based on nothing except the two people. The phrenological books on courtship and matrimony never refer to going to your parents and getting permission. They never refer to property arrangements. They never refer to social class. It's entirely a matter of personal compatibility. And part of this reconception of personal relationships involved sexuality itself. A number of theorists began to propose that physical affinity, physical attraction between men and women, and here I should add that it was crucial, for reasons that you'll see, it was crucial to exclude same-sex relationships from this, that physical affinity and attraction between men and women involved something like the biological equivalent of magnetism. Opposite poles are drawn to each other, essentially, and so they thought that sexual feelings were sort of like magnetism, really like magnetism, but some undiscovered magnetic fluid that was in the process of being discovered. And it's helpful, perhaps, to remember here what was happening in technology in the 1840s. 1844 was the year in which the telegraph was invented. Mysterious communication over long distances involving electric currents. That kind of thing is very much at the air. And in fact, at the other end of the spectrum, the 1840s was the period that gave rise to spiritualism, seances in which mediums get messages from the dead. And also in the Fourierite communes, such as the one here in Northampton, they were based on people's work, not interpersonal relationships, but their work was based on what the theorists called attractive industry. You would do the job that you were attracted to, not the job that you were assigned to do. At least that was the ideal. At any rate, these new theories promised a physiological justification of sexuality, even in the face of the kinds of sexual fears articulated by Graham and others in the 1830s. There was one crucial proviso, that true sexual affinity involved mutual attraction to the whole person, and not simply to their body. It's a problematic proviso, but that was their problem. And I don't have time to explore it here. It just was, it was there. This new justification for sexual relationships involved the notion that truly loving sex involved a reciprocal compensation of energy. That is to say, Graham had been arguing that sexual, not just orgasm, but that sexual arousal involved was dangerous because it involved the overexcitement and the loss of energy, debility. But this new notion, remember magnets, remember sexual relations as magnetically based, what is lost in good sexual intercourse by each partner is taken up into the other. So there's no net debilitation. There's an exchange of energy. This was in clear contrast to masturbation, where obviously there was no exchange at all. But it was also in clear contrast to sex without love, without wholehearted love, which was the magnetic equivalent of masturbation. Nothing really got exchanged in sex that was purely physical and that was devoid of this element of total affinity. In each case, then, masturbation and loveless sex, vital energy isn't exchanged at all, but it's simply lost. And the result, the 1840s reformers were quick to point out, was a progressive debilitation. So it's important to note that none of these new theories of sex and marriage in the 1840s rejected Graham's ideas, as you'll see in a minute. Rather, they assimilated his ideas and went beyond them in a way that Graham himself never did. Graham never made the move into the 1840s that these people, these new reformers did. So in other words, you can think of them not as being anti-Grahamite, but as post-Grahamite. I now want to turn to a couple of these, one radical and one mainstream. I could use any number of people, but I'm going to talk only about a single example of radical free love theory that developed in the 1840s. And my example is a couple who actually got married to each other late in the decade, named Thomas Lowe Nichols and Mary Gove, who became Mary Gove Nichols after her marriage to Thomas Lowe. Here's Thomas Lowe Nichols writing at the very beginning of the 1850s about what some people might now term foreplay. It's quite a difference from Graham, you'll see. The hands clasp each other with a thrill of delight. The lips cling together in dewy kisses, wet kisses, of inexpressible rapture. The bolder hands of man wander over the ravishing beauties of woman. He clasps her waist. He presses her soft bosom. And in the tumult of delirious ecstasy, each finds the central point of attraction and of pleasure, which increases until it is completed in the sexual orgasm, the most exquisite enjoyment of which the human senses are capable. Well, this hardly seems to inhabit the same cultural world as Sylvester Graham, especially inasmuch as the Nicholses also advocated free love and abhorred legal marriage. Yet, the two worlds were not so distant after all. First, the Nichols theory and practice were based, especially the theory, were based on the 1840s notions I've just summarized. That is to say, if sex was to be biologically healthy, it had to be generated by a union of persons and not just one of bodies. Here's the Nicholses writing together. When two persons loving each other come together in the sexual embrace, nature has provided that a portion of the nervous expenditure of each goes to strengthen the other, and that there is comparatively little loss. And in a union without love, or where all the enjoyment is on one side, the loss is greater, for there is less compensation. A merely sensual union is destitute of all spiritual and magnetic compensations. And where there is the simple, artificial, and utterly unnatural excitement of the orgasm without reciprocity, the result is only evil. I think he's saying there's only male orgasm and not female, but that's bad too. That was indeed the basis of the Nichols rejection of marriage. And indeed, they wrote, "It is certain that sexual freedom would result in more healthful moderation." So their radical ideology, they claimed, was going to actually result in less sex and, what the bottom line of this was, more autonomy for women to say no. Indeed, the Nicholses often sounded just like Graham. For example, now I'm quoting them, not him, "The abuse of amativeness." Amativeness is the phrenological name for lust or sexual desire. They called it amativeness. "The abuse of amativeness rapidly exhausts the nervous power. The generative function takes strength from the organic and animal powers. It fails and all fail. The stomach cannot digest for want of nervous energy, spent in oft-repeated and fruitless orgasms. Nutrition cannot be carried on. The waste matter is retained to poison the fountain of life. The skin becomes dry and withered, the eye dull, the mind weak and disordered. All noble passions lose their force. The whole system is discord and disorder and ready to become a prey to disease. I have never seen," this is Thomas Lowe Nichols writing, "I have never seen a case of epilepsy that was not caused by amative excess and generally by masturbation." Same man. It was just written this ecstatic description of good sex. The Nicholses even subscribed to a strict Grahamite diet, abhorring not just alcohol, meat, and tobacco, but also, and I'm quoting them here, "salt, pepper, spices, and all stimulating substances which provoke to venery." Even coffee stimulates the nervous system, and the stimulation is apt to take a sexual direction. The best diet? You guessed it, the regular use of coarse bread to soothe the system. So, there's people who are as radical as it was possible to get in the late 40s and early 50s of the 19th century. And you see how they've gone beyond Graham, but they haven't denied anything that he's said. They've assimilated him, they've transcended him, if you like. This is equally true of reformers who were in the mainstream, meaning not that they were in the middle of America, but they were in the mainstream of reform movements and not at the outer edge as the Nicholses were. Let me give you a single important example here. Orson Fowler, F-O-W-L-E-R. Fowler is best known, if he's known at all today, as America's major phrenologist. His influence was too widespread to be dismissed. Beginning in the 1840s, the early 1840s, right, beginning in 1840 actually, Fowler reached an amazingly wide audience in his roles as editor, writer, itinerant lecturer, and founder of an extremely important New York publishing firm, Fowlers and Wells. This firm virtually cornered the market for books and magazines about what could be called personal reform. It also, perhaps incidentally, perhaps not, published the first edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Much of Orson Fowler's own writing and much of his publishing firm's list of books address matters of health. Fowler strongly advocated temperance, soothing vegetarian diet, and the rest of the Graham system, including bread made of unbolted flour. He too made the association between dietary and sexual stimulation. And in his book, Amativeness, Fowler warned of the lethal dangers of self-abuse and matrimonial excess. The only cure for either of those was to abstain totally from both sexual and dietary stimulants, a kind of sexual and dietary teetotalism. But Fowler simultaneously extolled the rewards that sex could provide when it was based on mutual love and respect, and when it was performed in the appropriate circumstances. Under those conditions, sexual intercourse was both healthy and beautiful in the best sense. Fowler called it, and I'm quoting him, a commingling of the spiritual in man with the spiritual in woman, a spirituo-sexual communion, the intercommunion of kindred spirits, the ultimate repast of love. Sex and diet, in a metaphor there. Fowler speculated at length that an interchange of what he called magnetic fluids was involved here, or perhaps the commingling of electric and other fluids. They were trying to figure out what this thing was that was like magnetism, like gravity, but clearly it was different. Now, that was the language of the 1840s that I've just given you. And it's very clear that Sylvester Graham never adopted it. No magnetic interchange for him. No communion of spirits that could spiritualize sexual excitement and render it healthy. Graham did defend marriage and marital sex, but only as something that was rather less dangerous than any plausible alternative. Speaking of the manifold dangers of sex, here's what Graham wrote in what I think is the single passage in his work about marriage, in anything he wrote. This is what he wrote about marital sex. Between husband and wife, all the dangers either entirely lose or are exceedingly diminished in their effect. After a time together, the married couple become accustomed to each other's body, and their parts no longer excite an impure imagination. In other words, well, you know, marital sex was simply less exciting than non-marital sex. A married couple are not continually stimulated by the thought or the sight of each other and each other's bodies. For these reasons, Graham proposed, when they do engage in lovemaking, and here I'm quoting him again, there's married couples, and when they engage in lovemaking, their sexual intercourse is the result of the more natural and instinctive excitements of the organs themselves, and not of artificial arousement caused by the diet or the attraction that people feel when they've never been with another person. And Graham added that when a married couple's dietary and other habits are such as they should be, this intercourse occurs very seldom. And that was the reason, according to Graham, in this one passage about marriage, that was the reason that monogamous marriage was designed for what Graham called the highest welfare of man. I hope that makes it clear that Graham didn't move into the 1840s. He didn't add magnetism and the rest of it to the Graham system, as these largely, entirely younger reformers did. But to bring this story home, I want to sort of conclude, at least this part, there may be a brief epilogue or not. I want to conclude this part with the story about the relationship between Sylvester Graham and Mary Gov Nichols, whom I've already referred to as a radical reformer. In the 1830s, Mary Gov was regarded as the female Graham. This is the woman who's going to become the most extreme free love advocate in America, along with her husband, in the late 40s and into the mid-50s. Here's why that she became the female Graham. It's simple. In 1837, Sylvester Graham dared to speak about sexuality to an all-female audience in Portland, Maine. At the end of that lecture, coming out, he was assaulted by a mob. That this was too dangerous. It was Mary Gov, who was born in 1810, who essentially took over Graham's role in the capacity of lecturing to women. In 1838, she opened a Graham boarding school in Lynn, Massachusetts. She edited the Health Journal and advocate of physiological reform in 1840, filled it with quotations from Graham's Lectures on the Science of Human Life, just published. In 1842, she published her Lectures to Ladies on Anatomy and Physiology, which was Grahamism for women, including sexual advice. And in 1842, in 1842, that's what she published. Mary Gov and Sylvester Graham were friends from at least 1839 on, when they gave simultaneous lecture series in New York. And their lives frequently intersected after that. In 1839, Mary Gov took over the editorship of the Graham Journal of Health and Longevity when David Campbell went to Oberlin College. And she continued to give lots of space to Graham, and she helped raise money for him when he was in need, which he often was. But in the 1840s, as you already know, she got radicalized. She had been married unhappily to a man named Hiram Gove, whom she left in 1841, and from whom she kept trying to get divorced. There were 3 trials. By the mid-1840s, under the influence of a variety of other theorists, she turned against monogamous marriage. Obviously, personal experience was partly involved here, but it's in the air too, on grounds that monogamous marriage was both a form of legalized rape and that sex should be a product of real love. And real love was not usually confined to marriage, and real love might very well change its object from time to time. At about the same time, she and Thomas Low Nichols fell in love with each other. Thomas Low Nichols was a medical doctor, but also a Grahamite of long standing. He soon was going to become the editor of 2 magazines, the American Vegetarian and Health Journal and the Water Cure Journal and Herald of Reform, both published by Fowlers and Wells. And that should also give you an idea about where he stood, vegetarianism and water cure. Mary and Thomas established separate water cures in New York in the late 40s. They got married in 48. By the early 50s, they were publishing collaboratively written books attacking marriage and defending free love. But they split. And this obscure but very interesting story I owe to the historian Patricia Klein-Cohen, who has been researching Mary Gove and her husband, and who came across this in the records of a trial of Mary Gove's third divorce trial from Hiram Gove. Gove contested the divorce. And what Gove found is that Sylvester Graham delivered a deposition, filed a deposition in that 1848 divorce trial. As late as 1845, Mary Gove and Sylvester Graham were staffing a water cure in upstate New York together. 3 years later, Sylvester Graham filed a deposition that constituted a serious and sensational assault on her character, as he saw it. Graham claimed, and I don't want to quote many of the words because it's, I think that Pat Cohen has rights to them. Graham claimed that when he and Gove had been at that water cure together in 1845, she made a very direct, concerted attempt to seduce him. She told him how deeply attracted she was to him, and she promised that they would have great sex together. Specifically, Graham claimed that she said there was no doubt that she would have a 3-fold ecstasy with him. And indeed, in her later free love writings, Mary Gove did insist that women who had sex with men they loved often experienced multiple orgasms. But in this case, Graham reported that he had bravely and valiantly withstood her advances, indeed to such an extent that Mary Gove proceeded to ridicule him by telling him that he was an iceberg. In any case, it's known that Mary Gove departed from that water cure not long after her arrival there, even though, as Pat Cohen has found, both she and Graham had been announced as permanent staff members. According to the official story, she suffered from a recurrence of an old lung disorder, and the director of the water cure sent her back to New York City so that she could breathe better air. Yeah, Pat Cohen pointed that out to me in an email message that she wrote. She said, "Steve, that explanation sounded a bit strange to me. Better air in New York City in 1845 than in the mountains of Columbia County?" At any rate, this anecdote is the very apotheosis of what I meant when I referred to Sylvester Graham as a decade-specific reformer, a man who could not have existed before the 1830s and who, for whatever reasons, did not move out of the 1830s. And I think that that's, in part, in addition to personal eccentricities, what may account for the fact that he's disappeared. I have another reason, simpler and shorter, but I think I'd rather end my formal lecture now in the hopes that one of you will ask me what the other reason is, which is far less interesting, but I love the opportunity to propose it. So if one of you will, at some point, in what I hope will be an active question-answer session, ask that, I will try to answer it. Thank you.
Make it to Historic Northampton by 4 o'clock for the Arcadia Players concert. And rest assured, make sure that you'll have ample time to do that. But first, before we open the floor to questions, I know that Susan Well has an announcement to make.
I just wanted to say that the 350th calendars are hot off the press and they're available out there and from me. The parade and the fireworks were not the end of our celebration, and we're geared up for the fall.
Great. And they're out there on the table for people?
And they're out on the table, and I have some with me.
Great. Along with Sylvester Graham t-shirts, which I hope will disappear with you. Steve?
Okay. Am I expected to remain decorously behind the podium
You may
for this, or may I
roam the room.
I asked the techno people that.
You can do Phil Donahue if you like.
You'll follow me.
Yeah.
Don't bet on it. Yes.
What was Graham's early education, and where was he educated?
Yeah. His early formal education took place at Amherst Academy in 1823. A lot of this is going to get hazy to me because I did this work several generations ago. And I'm sure I've forgotten a lot, but I remember that he was born in 1794, and it wasn't until, well, how old would he be in 1823? He'd be 29. That he went to Amherst Academy, which was a kind of like prep school for Amherst College, which was itself just in the process of being founded right then. And it's on the side of, in Amherst, of the parking lot next to the Amherst Cinema. It was. And he lasted there something like a year. But he did, he studied later, he studied for the ministry, but this was private. I mean, so his education, it's hard to keep track of it. He really moved around. He really had an unstable early youth, in which he was not uncommon, which was not uncommon for Americans of this period. I think that, going from West Suffield to Rhode Island to New Jersey, and never staying in any one place long, never doing any one thing long. There's apparently evidence has turned up in recent years that he aspired to be one of those folk portrait painters in the late 20s, because there's a picture that's turned up that Sturbridge found that has, I think, the name Sylvester Graham on it. That's probably true, and I hadn't known that when I did my work. But that was the extent of his formal education. He obviously made the most of it. He was obviously smart. Is that an answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Please tell us the
it's actually not very sexy, but I think it's very important. And it's something that I only came to realize through going on eBay and buying a lot of 19th century health reform books in recent years. Plus, I've been interested in something called the history of the book, which I won't go into now, but it looks at books as books and not just as text. The great early historian of the history of the book, William Charbat, wrote back half a century ago that New York, not only did New York become the publishing hub, was becoming the publishing hub in the 1830s and 40s, but that even New England writers had to publish in New York to get themselves famous. And that's, could cite chapter and verse. In a word, Graham didn't do that. Now, there's, I think, a story here that explains why he didn't do that. Because when he was first publishing his lectures in the early 30s, he did publish them in New York, but his last New York imprint was 1834, or 35 possibly. What happened is that when Orson Fowler moved to New York in 39 and founded with his brother, Lorenzo, the firm Fowlers and Wells, by the middle of that decade, they had almost, as I said in the lecture, cornered the market on reform literature. It was the place to publish if you wanted to circulate. They're not as famous as the Harpers, of the Harper brothers, but The firm lasted for 80 years in the family. At the time, it was really, really important. It was a major firm. And Graham Graham would have been a natural for Fowlers and Wells to have published. An absolute natural. Because he was the founder of all the ideas that, you know, that the 1840s stuff that I was just talking about, they were all published by Fowlers and Wells. Why didn't Graham publish with them? I think I know the answer. And I think that the answer is that in his 2-volume magnum opus, The Science of Human Life, Volume 1 contains a chapter. This was written in the late 30s, before phrenology became so very popular. It was just becoming popular. Graham has a chapter in that critiquing phrenology. Not savaging it, but just sort of expressing skepticism about it. You know, the returns are not yet in. It doesn't convince me yet. And I think under the circumstances, Fowlers and Wells was not about to publish Graham. Because they were still in the process of making themselves. There were a lot of partisan stuff going on within the reform movement, and I don't think they wanted to publish something that contained a critique of their founding, whatever you want to call it, their founding ideological construct. Only after his death did Fowlers and Wells start publishing Graham, but by that time they were secure enough that Graham was almost a nostalgic figure to them. So that's, I think, the other reason that Graham's name has disappeared. I suspect that if that chapter hadn't appeared in the lectures on the science of human life, that Graham would have been published during the 40s by Fowlers and Wells, and that he would have become his ideology remained increased in popularity, but that it would have continued to be associated with the name Graham. Thank you. As I say, it's much less sexy than the other part of the story. Yeah, Chris.
Steve, we're used to the notion that alcohol, coffee, tea, and so forth are stimulants or intoxicants. Could you remind us what the physiological argument that Graham used, that meat was a stimulant?
Well, this is one of the places, it's been a long time since I've read this. Perhaps I read it more recently than I. I mean, meat is, you know, the traditional. I mean, all the, you know, I did some reading both in classical antiquity and, you know, up into the 19th century. And the idea is, if you want a quick fix for somebody who's in a weakened, exhausted condition, a shot of alcohol and meat. I guess, what is the reason? I can't remember it. Mike?
I think what he thought was that the body had to work a lot harder to digest meat than it did cereals and all.
Yeah, but it wouldn't. That wouldn't. Chris is specifically asking why it was stimulating.
Because it is.
We have an MD in the house. Is there a doctor in the house? Yes.
I could be wrong, but in Oliver Twist, they keep people out of gruel to keep them pretty manageable. You know, I believe that if they gave them a bit of meat, you know, they'd get stimulated.
Yeah.
That's what it does.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, no.
No. I mean, I was asking.
And of course, in the British Navy, until the last generation, you know, every naval enlistee was entitled to a shot of brown.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so.
Yes.
And why is it stimulating? Because it is. They have it on authority, Chris. But I don't remember the details, and I'm sure that's real. I don't think so. When I was doing this work, I read a lot in physiological theory. I did most of my research in the medical school library at the University of Wisconsin, and I learned a lot about about physiological theory, especially the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I made a point never to find out what contemporary views were. And to this day, I don't. I mean, I just thought it's best for me not to know the ending to be a good historian. So maybe I never really answered the question.
And you know, the notion he comes up with is sort of sexual continence, I guess it's sexual continence mostly. Some of these are sort of, transcendental in nature, what comes out through the yogis and all that Eastern literature.
Yeah, Gandhi was influenced by Graham.
Stuff like that. Does he come up with these ideas spontaneously, or do you think he's influenced by Eastern thought?
I don't think there's any evidence that he was influenced by Eastern thought. I don't know any route of transmission.
So he comes up with these
given
same
his
ideas.
background, for reading or encountering indirectly any Eastern thought, not before the 30s, not before the 40s, I think.
Who's that remarkable?
Certainly not before the 30s. Am I right? Am I wrong?
I don't know. They seem remarkably similar, so it's rather interesting.
Yeah, although, I mean, I don't know the ending of this, but I remember reading, that Gandhi was as much influenced by the West as vice versa. And I have to at least wonder, without answering the question, to what extent some of these Eastern traditions aren't themselves influenced by 19th century Western ideology. And I don't know the answer to that question. I have no way. But I think it's worth asking that question, just because, especially, from the nothing that I know about Hinduism. I mean, it's much more able to embrace Western traditions than Western traditions are to embrace it. I mean, sure, want to give us a little Christianity? Yeah, we'll take it. We can do that. So I don't know the answer, again, but as far as whether he was influenced by the East, the answer to that is either absolutely no, or it must have been by a route so indirect that I don't have access to it. Yeah?
Wasn't there some interchange through missionary work? When I think of one of the people who was at the Northampton Association had spent a number of years in India.
India before the 40s, Chris?
Yes, that's correct. There was a man called William Adam who had spent time in India in the 1820s and 1830s.
Any possible?
Well, he may have known Graham, but I think Graham was, Adam didn't come back to the United States until the late 1830s, so Graham would already have been developing these ideas.
Right. Graham had them all by 33 or 34. He didn't change after that.
However, there was, of course, a lot of trade taking place. And almost certainly there were ships bringing people and ideas and things back from India in the 1820s.
I mean, the other way of answering that question, which again, evades literally answering it definitively, is to say that there were, in fact, a lot more obvious routes of there were obviously a lot more obvious influences on Graham, and they came from Benjamin Rush, and they came from a pair of French physiological theorists named Bichat and Broussais, both of whom were translated into, Broussais was translated into English, and the translation was published in Philadelphia in the late 20s, and that's where Graham was in the late 20s when he was studying to become a temperance. He'd been hired by the Pennsylvania Temperance Society to become a lecturer for them after having left the formal ministry. And there's no question in my mind, and although I can't remember the details, they're in the book, there's no question in my mind but that Philadelphia was the place where he would have encountered these latest European ideas. And it was from Broussais especially that he came up with the idea of the important role of the autonomic nervous system in linking various systems that had previously been thought to be separate. So from Broussais, he was able to get the idea that, that your diet can influence your sexuality and vice versa. And from Bichat and Rush, he got the idea that stimulation and debility were not opposites, which was, I think, that goes back, to humoral theory and way back. And this is all related to the, if you like, it's a part of a long story in the modernization of medicine. I mean, and part of the overturning of humoral theory of humors, that, which is basically a theory of balance, which strikes me as having, I hesitate to say this in public, but let's pretend this is private, but the kind of balance elements in humoral theory strike me as being more Eastern than what replaced it. Is that, anybody here know anything about Chinese medicine? That's because it's what I'm thinking of. It's the idea of just putting everything back in balance. That's out of balance. And that's old, in the West, that goes back a long way, using humors and some other things too. But in the middle of the, that was simply overturned. And Graham's ideas were part of an overturning. I mean, in that sense, I suppose they were on the right side. I guess, you know, I'm talking as if I know the ending. And I really should. Yeah?
I just wondered if this abstemious diet, it was in fact soothing and so on, or did people in fact suffer debility from not having iron and all the various things that you would get from eating meat?
That's a medical question.
I picture people sort of becoming sort of thin and pale and getting consumption and things.
Well, this is an indirect answer, but it's statistical, although I don't have the statistics that I accumulated, and I'm not going to try to see if I have them with me yet. What I did when I was translating my dissertation into a book, the last piece of research that I did, and it took me a long time to do, even though it takes up only a page or two in the book, was I traced the one organization that I knew consisted of people who would voluntarily put themselves on the Graham system. And this was an organization that I referred to in the lecture called the American Physiological Society, founded in Boston by David Campbell and Graham. And it had, I think, like 150 members. And what I decided to do was to search all those members, because they were all living in or around Boston in 1837, and to find out as much as I could about them, and then to do the same thing with the control group of people whose last names began with the same letters. You know, I tried to randomize it a bit. And the first thing that I found about who they were is that they were preponderantly craftsmen and artisans, respectable, perhaps successful. The modal occupation was housewright, and the second from modal occupation was piano maker. 6 and 4, large numbers, and I'm sure people knew each other. That had something to do with it. Both of these were people who came out of furniture building and cabinet making, respectively. So artisanal crafts, but these were people who were establishing themselves as businessmen. One of the piano makers actually developed a fairly important patent for using the middle pedal on the piano in the late 30s. So, but most of them you don't know much about. There were no proletarians, there were no farmers, there were no members of the elite in that group, which obviously, and that doesn't correspond statistically to my control sample. Well, the other thing that I did was that I looked to see, I was just doing some fairly crude geographical mobility. I checked on them, I forget how many decades later, 2 or 3 decades later or 4 decades later, and I found something like 3 times as many of them were still living within 15 miles of Boston as something like 3 times as many. I mean, an outrageously higher proportion than my control group were still living within 15 miles of Boston, meaning that the others either moved away or they had died. So I would say that this was a group of people who I had no idea what the outcome of that work was going to be, but it turns out that they were just more stable. So apparently they didn't weaken and die. I don't know if they kept up the grain diet either. But
did they propagate?
Did they propagate? I don't know. I'm sure they did. Well, look, the general context of this, did they propagate, is that America as a whole, if I remember this correctly, demographically, in 1800, the United States had the highest birth rate in the Western world. In 1900, it had the lowest. Now, something's happening. And probably more than one thing is happening. But I am absolutely persuaded that one of the things that was happening was that the Graham system provided an adjunct to it, provided a form of birth control. Because according to what happened with Graham theory in the 1840s, the phrenologists made a lot about the health of first the pregnant woman, and then after birth, the health of the lactating mother. And what they basically said was, you shouldn't have sex for 3 years. You should have sex during pregnancy, and you should nurse for 2 years. So it's almost 3 years. So I don't know how many people did that, or didn't do that, but that must have been one of the ways that the birth rate went down. One of the ways. classes that we're talking about, perhaps a fairly important way. So, I mean, there was some, I mean, to talk very simple-mindedly, and then this doesn't explain a lot, but there's a lot less need for labor if you're living in the city than if you're living on a farm. Well, depending on where, in the United States, at least. I hesitate to say that so loudly, but I mean, there was a need to, you need labor in one case, and children are just a source of morphine you have to feed if you're an artisan. You're not going to have all your kids become artisan apprentices. As if you're a farmer, good job for everybody. If you've got one of these artisanal craft skills. So these are just the kind of people that you expect would find other appeals to something so there's a reason for you not to do what you might otherwise want to do. I mean, that there's an important reason. And Graham would have said the reason was your own health, and Fowler and the 1840s people would have added, there's also the health of your babies, of your family. If you have too much sex, if you have, if you have sex during pregnancy or lactation, if the diet is bad, your kids are going to grow up weak, and they're going to grow masturbators. I mean, this was with me in the Boy Scout manual when I was a kid. Yeah.
Steve, I'm just wondering about another impression of maybe Grant's decline in the 1840s.
Yeah.
When I look at the 20s and 30s, this is, as you described, at the time of utopian rise and so forth, it strikes me that those decades were more idea-centered. In the 1840s, you start to see a lot of organization, a lot of institutionalization. Grant strikes me as almost a Groucho Marx, I don't want to belong to any club that as a member person. I wonder if
like Thoreau's like that.
Yeah, I wonder if that might be what your impressions are of that thesis.
Yeah, I think it's true. From what I know about it. The hardest thing to find out about a person is what she was really like. I know a lot more about what went on inside Graham's head than I do about how he acted. And that's, I think, a very important part of the person that I came to know, but also at least as important a part that I didn't ever come to know. But yeah, he does seem to have been a bit of a loner. And to a certain extent, you can say that's personal. And to a certain extent, you can say that the 1830s was a time when it, for the first time, became possible to make an ideology out of being a loner. And so before the 1830s, there were probably plenty of loners, but they just would have been regarded as, and would have regarded themselves, as sort of misfits, probably. But beginning in the 1830s, it was possible for you to actually stand up and say, I don't care what you think of me. I'm who I am, and you can't touch me. In fact, this is the project that I'm trying to work on right now, which is that process psychological. Yes?
Did the Branly theories, and I'm thinking a bit of the abstinence and sexual aspect, influence who the national political characters were at the time, just as perhaps we're seeing an abstinence theme coming out of the present political religious strife? Did these theories influence who the national leaders were at the time?
It would be an interesting study of the birth rates of presidents, children, and children of other, members of the elite. I guess that would be one way to do it. I do know, that Orson Fowler's, the people who came to him to get chronological exams are pretty much on the record, and I have no head for remembering this, but there are 5 U.S. presidents, future U.S. presidents, who had Fowler or one of his associates do phrenological exams. John Brown did. Most abolitionists did. Garrison did. So it clearly affected a lot of people. Now I'm thinking, which presidents are they? And this is now something I haven't thought about in a long time, and I don't remember who they are anymore. But it would be interesting if they were in fact the, quote, self-made men president. And not the president, obviously the founding fathers were not. But if it turned out that these were figures who moved into the political elite from a themselves. I can't answer your question better than that. Sorry. Yes, Rick.
What's your sense of if you understand Graham's deep impulse to produce on the body a literal way to make stability?
Yeah.
What's your sense of the larger, I don't know, cultural and social motivations behind that desire for the stable?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the important question. I mean, the simplest, but the way I've been dealing with that for 30 years or more, and that's too long a time for me not to have to rethink it, but it's at least where I started from, is a rather too-pat idea that this is a generation who grew up expecting, because it had been the way most people had grown up, being both protected and controlled by institutions ranging from the family on out to a ring of concentric circles. They expected those institutions to control them. And for that reason, there was less of a need to generate purely internal controls, because you could count on other people. I mean, you could count on them. That's a funny way to say it. I mean, you knew that they were going to be there watching you. I mean, and you can see that, I mean, in all kinds of ways. The way that just popped into mind is domestic architecture. You know, before the period that I'm talking about, houses lacked both external and internal privacy, except among the very well-to-do. I mean, that is to say, you know, houses were built right up against the street, even in urban, you know, in urban and within rural areas. My house on South Pleasant Street for 22 years was essentially one of those houses in Amherst. They weren't built away. Inside, people didn't have private space. All kinds of things were public. And so, in other words, there was, I think, an assumption of watchfulness in a whole lot of ways. And other people were watching you. You had to watch yourself being watched, but you didn't have to watch what was going on inside. You just had to control what you did. And when that fell away, I think it removed both a set of grievances and a set of protections. And it left people who came of age, many people who came of age in the 30s, well, beginning in the bit before the 30s and continuing on, in a funny situation of simultaneously being totally liberated and then totally at a loss as to what to do with that. And so my pat answers that I've developed to that kind of question is that this was the generation, the people within that generation that needed to develop a set of internal controls for the first time, for people really to watch themselves and to take care of themselves. I used to call it an internal gyroscope, to substitute for the external one. So they had to make themselves more stable because nobody else was going to do it for them. And a lot of people fell apart. You know, William Lloyd Garrison's brother, a good example, became a drunkard. And, you know, I mean, this kind of self-made man, you know, and we're really, came about with a lot of conflict. And part of that change was internal. You know, I'm talking now about what's going on in people's heads. That also corresponds to what's going on in people's feet. And it's both. And you know, one of them becomes almost part of the other. But that's the best answer I can give. Yes.
You mentioned that he had trained for the ministry at one point.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that.
And also his father and grandfather had both been evangelical ministers.
Oh, really?
Well,
you also mentioned that he didn't use religion as a basis for his theories at all.
Right.
Right. Did he reject the church completely? Or was he still a church member?
I don't know. Mike? Was he ever a church member in Northampton?
I don't know. I know he spent the last part of his life writing that a book trying to substantiate that the Bible supported all his views.
You have it in your pocket.
I have in my packet. As I said, it's too dense to read, but that's the whole basis of it, was that the Bible supported all his theories, and that's how he spent his last years in Northampton.
He spent his last years writing. When was it first published?
1857. His wife sold his notes to followers.
It was not published during his lifetime?
No.
Okay. And I saw that from your book, from your copy, that it was Flowers and Wells.
Flowers and Wells did it, yeah.
That published it. But again, it's 57, it's after, 6 years after he's dead, and they've already published The Science of Human Life. But that's interesting. I see, I mean, if you think of the 40s for him as a period of increasing retreat, then one of the things he retreated back into was, oh, finally, what have I left out of all this? Religion. And so he then goes back and writes a book trying to show that the Bible favored the Graham system and did not demand the eating of meat, did not ask people to drink wine. I mean, it's a tough road to hoe. And you can see him, I mean, struggling through this. But it's sort of like at the very end, when he's out of the mainstream, I think in a very personal way, he's also writing stuff that's trying to probably reconcile, you know, let me do psychobabble for a moment. He's finally trying to reconcile himself with the family that had never supported him. Because his father died when he was 2. But the fact that Mike, that you don't know that he's a church member or not, shows, I mean, just how unimportant this seems to have been for him. I mean, it was, you know.
It also may have some impact on why he had as little impact in the long run.
Yeah, although Flowers and Wells are largely secular. I mean, it's interesting. They published hardly anything about Christianity. And I don't know whether Flowers and Wells' list was not bought by evangelicals. I'd love to know that, you know, just as a historian. I mean, because they are basically, as reformist as they are, they're really not evangelical, and they don't cater to that, explicitly to that market. And in fact, Fowler did write a book called Religion, Natural and Revealed. And what I remember taking away from that book was that it just lambasted revivals as being essentially a kind of Grahamite excitement, you know, that was going to sort of destroy destroy piety, and you know, well, you know, I can see that book would have turned off a certain constituency. I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good one. Yeah.
Stephen, you had sent me a quote one time by a fellow, I think his name was
Trawl.
From the water cure, and he had written about Graham that one of the reasons why Graham didn't have respect was because he had a bad life at home.
Well, the woman problem, I mean the wife problem.
Yeah.
I kept away from that one.
You opened that can of worms, you got to hear it now.
I don't even remember. Mike, you know this better than I.
Well, and basically it was that
She didn't observe his system.
yeah, that Graham didn't have a lot of respect in the community because he revealed his problems. His wife wouldn't talk to him at home, so he'd stop strangers on the street. He complained about his wife, and he got this reputation as eccentric. Thrall was saying, if you want to be successful in life, you have to have a good, solid marriage where your wife will listen to you. So you don't babble out to people on the street.
Yeah, that's 19th century domestic reform, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose that's probably another way that Graham didn't modernize.
I know some of you will probably want to say hello to Steve after the lecture, and many of you have to want to make it to the concert at 4 o'clock. So maybe we should call it an end to the public questions. And,
That's your call, Karen.
Yeah, so let's call it an end to the public questions. And thanks, Steve, very much for coming over.